Okay folks, this is Norm the teacher, and I've got that urge to teach you something else today, and so I'm going to. This video is going to be on the 91 Mazda, and I want to give you an overview of the anatomy of the front strut of one, for those of you that may have taken one apart and don't know how to get it back together, or for you wiser ones that want to get information before you take it apart. And so here it goes. And remember, this is the front strut. The rear strut is a little bit different than the front strut, and I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, here it is. I've got it all apart. I'm filming with two cameras, so I got to move things around a lot. This is basically the part where the knuckle attaches inside here, and then your spring goes in here, and here's your piston, and then there's the spring itself, and then a splash cover, and then the top part, and another top part, and then the nut that holds the top parts in up here. Okay, so basically here's how it goes together. You got this rubber cushion, and notice there's little notches on the bottom. Okay, notches on the bottom. Okay, that tells you how to put it on. You know, do you put it on this way? Or do you put it on this way? Well, the notches tell you, because there's little bumps here that correspond to those notches, right here. And so that tells you how to put that on. Get the little notches above each little bump here. Okay, so that's a rubber cushion. And, a couple things. This rebar that's welded here, ignore that. I got some rebar here also. Ignore that. That's part of a system that I devised to make it easier to compress the spring with my spring compressor to take things apart. I'll do a separate video on that. But just ignore the rebar being welded onto different things for right now. This rebar is not welded on here. One of the lug bolts holds each one. Okay, back to anatomy here. So I got the rubber cushion on. Now, what goes over the rubber cushion is this splash guard. And this cup end is what faces up. This cup end eventually fits into this area right here. Right there. Okay, right there, from my other camera. Okay, so the cup end goes over the thing like that. Okay. Then you can put your spring on. Now notice on the spring, when you take it apart, you want to make match marks. See these little slits I have here? Little notches that I cut? Hope that shows up. Yeah, they're there. One here and one there. I did that with a cutoff tool, and then I also made one up here. Okay, you want to make match marks like that so that you know how this spring aligns with this base. So you put the spring on, and notice that there's two ends. There's an end here that's fully round, and then there's an end here that's kind of flat and tapered. Okay, the flat tapered end is what goes up, and this goes on the base. Okay. So I put it on like this, and I take this match mark that I made here, these two match marks, and I line them up with the match mark that I made in the base, which is right here. Okay, so I'll turn it around and get those match marks to line up. Now notice how the match marks, whoop, I don't have my vise holding this in tight enough. I better tighten that a little bit. Okay. Notice how the match marks line up. Here, here, and here. The match mark on the second spring really wasn't too necessary, but you do want it on the base where the spring makes contact with the base. Okay, now the spring's on. Okay, now what goes on next is this. Now, here's the difference between a front strut and a rear strut. A rear strut does not have to rotate. But a front strut has to be able to rotate like this because your wheels turn. When you turn your wheels, this whole assembly in the knuckle here turns, depending on which way you're turning your wheels. And so the bolts that attach your strut to the very top of the body of the car, they remain stationary. Those never turn. But the strut underneath it has to be able to turn. And that's the reason for this, what looks like a Torrington bearing. Okay? So the Torrington bearing, and what a Torrington bearing is, it's a flat bearing, and you have needles under it. I don't know if there's any needles or not. This might just be a bushing. But it turns. Other camera. It turns to allow for the rotation of the strut while the top part remains stationary. And it fits in here like this. Here's the top part that's upside down. That fits in like this. And then it'll rotate on that, right there. See? Okay, so this goes on first. That's this piece. And it goes on the spring like this. Now I made a match mark here too. See that notch right there? I'm in bright sunlight here and it's kind of hard to see with my camera. But a match mark there. That match mark corresponds to this match mark. These two match marks. I hope they're showing up. I'm filming towards the sun, so they may not be. But anyway, so I'll put that on there. I'll show how it's going on. It goes up like this, like this. Then I line up the match marks. Gosh, now I'm looking directly in the sun, and it's hard for me to see what I'm doing here. Probably should have done this inside. I gotta find the match mark. Oh, there it is. Right here, right here. Right there. Okay, so I put it up here. Right there, on top. And then this whole assembly goes up here. And notice how it rotates. Okay, now that's the difference between the front and the rear. The front has to be able to rotate. Now this isn't really what rotates when you're using the car. This remains stationary because it's bolted to the body of the car, but it's your strut and spring and everything else below it that does rotate when you turn your wheels. So that Torrington bearing that I showed you is an important part. And this thing's about ready to fall over again. So, but you get the idea here. So I'm going to put that down. I'm going to take this back down. And of course you got a rubber cushion here. You want to leave that on there. It'll be stuck on there when you take the thing apart, but it does come off. And then of course the final step would be, notice how the spring is way above the top of the bolt. Well, that spring has to be pulled downward so that that bolt ultimately goes through that hole that you see where my thumb's pointing, right there. Okay? Now look at the distance it has to be pulled down. See right there? So, and that brings up a point on safety. Do not remove this nut until you have a spring compressor holding this spring on two sides at least. And you can get a spring compressor for struts like this at Harbor Freight. Although I modified mine because I made it where it's a lot longer, and that's a whole separate video. But I made it longer so that it could have more reach. I needed more reach. But anyway, notice how far above the bolt or the nut that the spring is. So that's all got to be compressed down so that the bolt goes through this hole right here in the center. Okay. All right, so that's a safety thing. Do not, and I repeat, do not take off this nut. And you may need an impact wrench to do it. When there's nothing holding the spring, because it will fly apart. And the first time I did this, I did do that because I wasn't thinking. And fortunately, I had it laying on the ground, and it did fly apart, but no injuries occurred because of the way I was positioned. But injuries certainly could have happened. And so don't, make sure you've got a spring compressor properly attached to these springs before you take that nut off. And so that nut then is constantly holding all this spring tension all the time when the thing is put together. Okay, so that's a little bit about the anatomy of a front strut on a 1991 Mazda 626. Another difference between the rear and the front is the front, notice the front has 4 studs. The rear one only has 3. They're triangularly positioned, and so that's another difference. And the rear one doesn't have to rotate because the rear wheels don't rotate. So that's it. The anatomy of the front strut of a 91 Mazda 626. See you in the next video, folks.